Now, consider some other questions. Sociologists define blank as a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people, whereas is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or another cultural factor. And you can choose between A, situational ethnicity, symbolic ethnicity, B, ethnicity race, C, race ethnicity, D, ethnicity and symbolic ethnicity. And the answer is C, race and ethnicity. From a sociological perspective, a minority status is determined by numbers. Is this true or is this false? And the answer is that it's false. In sociological terms, being a member of a minority group has more to do with equality and inequality rather than numbers. What is a minority? A minority group is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and resources available to the dominant groups of a society. It is not necessarily fewer in number than the dominant group. In South Africa, blacks dramatically outnumber whites by a ratio of 7-1. Yet, before the 1994 election of President Nelson Mandela, whites controlled the country, whereas blacks occupied the lowest status in that society. Minority does not mean numerically inferior. It refers to the group that has the least access to resources of power. However, it is interesting to note that the unequal and unfair treatment of the minority group typically generates a strong sense of common identity and solidarity among group members. Let's now look at racism, privilege, prejudice, and discrimination. Racism is a set of beliefs about the claimed superiority of one racial or ethnic group. It's used to justify inequality, and often it's rooted in the assumption that differences between groups are genetic. Colorblind racism is an ideology that removes race as an explanation for any form of unequal treatment. Sometimes people argue that racism is no longer an issue in the United States. It is true that our race relations have changed, but many sociologists argue that racism has not been eliminated. In the past, it was socially acceptable in many places to display racist attitudes and to use racist racial slurs. That's not politically correct or acceptable anymore. So people tend to reserve their attitudes until they know they're in like-minded company. However, this in no way means that racism has been eliminated. It's just more difficult sometimes to identify, which many argue that it's actually gotten worse. Some definitions: prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a thought process. It's an idea about the characteristics of a group. It's applied to all members of that group. It's unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it. Discrimination, on the other hand, is an action. It's the unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group, and it's usually motivated by prejudice. It's important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an internal evaluation, and discrimination is an action. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it is important to know that that's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced yet not discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate yet not be prejudiced. For instance, a manager may refuse to hire Chinese people because other people in the office don't like them, even though the manager doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. We continue with our discussion of prejudice and discrimination. Individual discrimination is discrimination carried out by one person against another. Institutional discrimination is the systemic discrimination carried out by social institutions, be they political, economic, educational, and others, that affects all members of a group who come into contact with it. While any kind of discrimination is problematic, institutional discrimination is bigger than individual discrimination and is more difficult to address. Individual discrimination is a type of discrimination by one individual against another. Institutional discrimination refers to a structural disadvantage for an entire group of individuals based on their group membership. Institutional discrimination is often more difficult to observe because it is not just one person acting against another. It might instead be embedded in policies, rules, traditions, or beliefs, and usually no one person can be held accountable. Therefore, eliminating institutional discrimination is a significantly more challenging task than eliminating individual discrimination. Defining race and ethnicity. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. And ethnicity is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or another cultural factor. Humans, regardless of their race, are 99.9% genetically identical. However, race is still used to classify people, and sometimes race is the basis for differential treatment of individuals or groups of people. Sociologists then have come to understand race as a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Race is more meaningful to us on a social level than it is on a biological level. The Amish, for instance, are a distinct ethnic group in American society, linked by a common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are also white. On the other hand, the Jewish people, contrary to what the Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, are an ethnic group, but not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they are not inextricably linked. Sociologists see race and ethnicity as social constructions because race isn't based on biology. For instance, we don't test DNA to determine race. Racial categories change over time. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Back to the idea that racial categories change over time. If you look at the U.S. Census, you will see that the categories of races change very frequently. In fact, 2000 was the first year that respondents were allowed to select one or more races in the racial category. Prior to 2000, residents were forced to select only one race, even if they would describe themselves as bi or multiracial. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Instead, the boundaries defining racial categories are flexible. For example, there is no set regulation for determining racial identity. A person may have ancestry from mixed descent, yet may not identify with that descent. Or a person who was born in the United States, whose parents and grandparents were also in the United States, might classify him or herself as Cuban because a great-grandparent was from Cuba. The distinction between race and ethnicity is important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending upon individual preferences, while racial identities are always on display. If we think about some of the historical immigrant groups such as Italians and Polish and other groups that came primarily from European countries, despite the fact that these immigrants weren't considered to be white upon their arrival, after a period of time, many of these immigrants learned to speak like Americans and took on an outwardly American lifestyle. They were able to hide their ethnicity as a way to alleviate the tension caused by cultural clashes and the bigotry against them. Let's talk about displaying ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on specific occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life. Situational ethnicity is an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending upon its usefulness in a given situation. You may have a friend whom you've met recently who surprised you because you had no idea that she was of Irish heritage until St. Patrick's Day when she proudly displayed her ethnicity. This ethnicity may not impact her day-to-day life, but it becomes relevant in this occasion. This is an example of symbolic identity. Situational identity may not be relevant on a certain date, but rather based on a certain situation. For example, if you are of a certain ethnicity and you know that your employer is prejudiced against people of your ethnicity, you may choose not to disclose your identity in an effort to preserve your job. However, when you are applying for financial aid at college and you see there is a scholarship available for someone within your ethnicity, you may choose to reveal your ethnic identity in this potentially beneficial situation. We talk a bit more about the social construction of race. Racial passing, or living as if one is a member of a different racial category, has a long history in the United States. Double consciousness, W.E.B. Du Bois' term for the divided identity experienced by Black people in the United States. The way we are perceived in the physical world, our embodied identity, has historically been used as a basis for discrimination. This issue becomes particularly interesting today as we examine online communication, where our physical traits are often hidden from those with whom we interact. Race, ethnicity, and life chances. Race and ethnicity influence all aspects of our lives, including health, education, work, family, and interactions with the criminal justice system and healthcare. You might remember that Max Weber's idea of life chances, that our opportunities in life are different depending upon the class into which we are born. We've talked earlier about how race and gender intersect with class. So how could a person's race affect their life chances? Think about it for a moment. Well, healthcare is an area in which we find widespread disparity between racial and ethnic groups. Disparities in access to healthcare may help explain the differing life expectancy rates for men and women of different races.